Hi, my name's Alison Frischke. Growing paddock feed and timing operations to make the best use of that feed are key determinants for the production and profitability of a livestock enterprise. Today's podcast explores how a mixed farming business uses standing cereal crops for grazing and the benefits that they see for their sheep enterprise and managing the paddock. I'm talking with Bailey Petering, a mixed farmer from Corombe near Matoa. The Petering family have been operating a standing crop pasture rotation in their mixed farming business for several years. Welcome, Bailey. Thanks for coming on for a chat today.
Thanks for having me on.
No worries. Now, before we start, I'll quickly explain what we mean by a standing crop. We've been grazing cereal crops for a long time now, usually starting when crops are young and vegetative and before the legume pastures get going. Then the crop's locked up, taken through to harvest. Crops aren't really grazed past stem elongation unless it's sown as part of a pasture mix and it might have a couple of grazers, or it's failed due to the season or a weather event, frost or heat stress, and there's an attempt made to salvage some of the value of that crop. In contrast, we're talking here about a standing crop that's been sown and treated as a crop. So let's hear about how the Peterings have been successful with their standing crop pasture system. So Bailey, just to set the scene, can you describe your farm business?
Yeah, we are a family farm. I work with my brother and my dad and my uncle. We grow grain crops, hay crops, fat lambs and wool.
You've been using standing crops for a while now into your 8th season. Can you tell me a bit about what your pastures used to be and how you got into using the standing crop system?
We used to graze Latrobe barley, which was a good system, but we ended up with a lot of weed issues.
So by changing to the current system, you've been able to overcome that or manage them in those grazing years?
Yes, by using Clearfield barley, we've been able to clear out our barley grass, silvergrass issues that we had under these crops, which were getting in the lamb's wool and eyes and causing a lot of grief.
So I'm keen to understand a bit more about what you do. Can you describe the areas that you're using for your pasture paddocks?
Most of our sheep paddocks are between 12 to 45 hectares in size, so they're reasonably small to help manage the grazing across them a bit more evenly. We run a 2-year rotation, the first year being Spartacus barley with a clover bank underneath, and the second year is just a regenerated barley, what falls out of the head or gets spread out the back of the header, and all the other grasses and clovers that come up underneath as well in the second year.
So those paddocks, are they generally poor cropping ground paddocks?
Yeah, they're more difficult paddocks for the cropping enterprise as they have more trees or a smaller inch in size.
So they make good grazing paddocks though, because they've got some timber, got some shelter.
That's right. They make excellent lambing paddocks.
So what cereal variety have you settled on in this standing crop system?
We've settled on a Clearfield Spartacus barley at this stage, a shorter variety, so aiming to have a bit less fungicide issues. And the Clearfield chemistry really helps with our weed control.
And that's something you've already got in the silo? You haven't had to buy in a separate pasture seed?
Yeah, we grow this as our standard barley across the cropping program. That's the only barley that we've sown.
So it's well adapted to the area and you've watched it grow in the past, so you know how it performs in terms of early vigour and how much feed it's going to be supplying for the sheep. It's not a new crop.
No, we know exactly what we're going to get with this Spartacus barley year in, year out.
Yep, and I guess we choose crop types that are fit for purpose. In your case, you've chosen the Clearfield chemistry to help with those weed control issues, but also so it's got that good grain protein because we're in a finishing lamb system, so it's going to provide that later, whereas some of the forage types don't have a lot of high-value protein grain. So let's talk about sheep. When's the paddock ready to graze? When do you actually put animals in?
Usually just before we lamb down at the end of July. We aim to get these paddocks ready to go before then, which is getting sown on time, spraying the broadleaves out on time, and usually getting urea out if we've got a good early start. And once the sheep do go in, quite often we have to put out a fungicide just before they lamb in July.
So what animals are going in first on that? You said you've got a breeding system, you produce wool, you've got ewes and lambs. What's going in?
We'll put our pregnant ewes into these standing crops at a younger stage growth, and they will lamb down on them as the barley provides good protection for the lambs to keep them out of the weather, and it's great feed so the ewes don't have to move too far away from their lambs. These lambs will stay on these paddocks for the foreseeable future. The ewes will stay in with them until they're weaned off at the end of October. We'll take the ewes out. They come out in very good condition, and the lambs will stay on these paddocks.
Yep, so lambs go back in as the crops are ripening and setting grain.
Yeah, that's right. That way they are not required to be adapted to the barley grain source as they're on it as it matures.
And that's a really important thing, isn't it? Because you're not having to do an introduction to the grain. The lambs have been on the paddock. They've been grazing alongside their mums. If you've had a feeder in there, they get used to taking grain from the feeder as well because it's that imprint feeding with their mums. During the milky dough stage, crops can become less palatable to the sheep. Do you find that the sheep's activity slows down at all?
Not necessarily. As the ewes have been on for a while, they selectively graze different areas at different times as they're at different stages and obviously taste different, which they tend to sit where they find it most palatable.
Yep. And the crops are regrowing there, staying fresh. So you end up with some different growth stages in there so that they can always find something to eat out there. How do you get those ewes ready to go into the paddocks?
We have a fair-sized fallow portion left out each year. So these ewes, through our cropping months, left on these fallows on the regenerative barley that's grown, or self-sown barley. And this usually carries them into June. If we haven't had the rain in time for this green growth and the stubbles have run out of dry grain, they will go into containment for a month so they don't walk the condition off.
And because they're pre-lambing, they've probably had their annual vaccinations.
Yes, they will have a U-guard and an Erivac prior to lambing before they go out into these paddocks.
So it's quite a nice system that you've got where sheep are on the crop as a green crop through to that ripening stage because their rumens are adapting to the changing energy levels in there, and so they're well adapted by the time grain's set. Just looking at some other nutrition, we know cereals are low in sodium and calcium, so are you supplying some supplements to them out there?
We do provide a salt and lime mix, 4-to-1, and also the clover underneath is a legume which provides the ewes with extra calcium when they require it throughout the milking stage of the lambing period.
Yeah, and when we graze really young crops, it's advised to put magnesium out there in the form of Cause Mag. Do we need to do that if we're grazing later in the year?
No, we've never had an issue with this, the way that we've set these paddocks up for the ewes to live in.
When we take a look at protein changing over time, so young cereal crops are really high in protein and energy, and as the crop matures towards anthesis or that hay cutting time, our protein falls down to around 7 to 8.5% protein and may not be adequate for growing lambs. So growing lambs need sort of 16 to 20. If they're growing 100 to 200 grams per day, they need 16 to 20% protein. How do you manage that shortfall at that time of year?
Once the clover runs out underneath, the lambs have eaten it all up. We will put a lentil feeder out, which helps to top up what the lambs require when they're eating pure cereal.
Yep, and so that's just seconds?
Yep, just lentil seconds from the cropping program.
Cheap, good source of protein. Are there any tricky things that you've had to juggle around when you're managing the crops and the animals together?
Yes, it's very tricky to manage around the fungicide of things. As the disease usually creeps in at the end of July with these big bulky crops, and that's when we intend to lamb down, it makes it tricky. We usually have to try and put the fungicide out a week or two earlier than we'd like to, and we have to lock the ewes up for a week due to the withholding periods. And luckily we have timbers beside most paddocks that we can lock these ewes up in for a week, or we can put out a hot wire around them on part of the paddock to spray the rest of it so that it doesn't wither away.
Excellent. So and nitrogen and any herbicides have already been applied well before the ewes go in.
Yes, the broadleafs and the urea are usually out well before the ewes are looking to go out onto these paddocks.
So we mentioned it briefly before, but what about paddock utilisation? How do you manage to get them to graze across large areas?
As I mentioned before, we have a couple of hot wires that we use every year pretty well. The ewes do tend to graze areas, and to more evenly graze the paddock, we'll set up a hot wire to lock the ewes in a patch that they don't particularly go to on their own choice.
So when do you normally take animals out of these standing crop paddocks?
The animals are usually taken off these paddocks after the grain runs out or ground cover is becoming a bit of an issue. Sometimes the lambs that are born on a paddock will stay on the paddock until they're sold in January if we have really good ground cover and good feed on the ground.
Have there been many years where you haven't kept grazing the crop, where you've actually ended up cutting it for hay and harvesting?
Yes. Most years we'll either cut hay or harvest some grain off these paddocks. We have a good area left out just to cover us in case the season goes horribly wrong. We don't want to run out of feed. Worst case, we could put them into containment if we have to, but we've never had to do that before. We've always looked after these paddocks well enough to get some grain on the plant.
So I guess it really depends how the seasons run, what those commodity prices are doing later in the year and how much feed you need. And it's a year-by-year basis. It's really quite flexible that way. So finishing up, what would be your tips for growers starting a standing crop sort of pasture system?
Treat the crop as if it were for harvest. So make sure you sow it on time, put the appropriate amount of fertiliser on, and make sure you get good weed management on it. Don't skimp just because it's a sheep paddock. Second point, know your feed value and manage protein requirements for finishing lambs. And the third point, make sure you're flexible to respond to how the season pans out. We have enough area set out so that if it is a dry year or a wet year, we can manage that, whether it be through providing feed at a time when there is typically a gap, or jumping at hay or harvest opportunities that present themselves in a wet year.
Great. So just through our conversation, to summarise, I see it as sowing that standing crop as a normal grain crop, then we're assessing it during winter, early spring for its best end use and dollar return opportunity depending on what you need, how the season's going and what prices are doing. Crops are really good at supporting late pregnancy and lambing ewes and can be used to finish lambs, supporting those high growth rates that they need to finish during the spring feed gap before stubbles are ready. There's likely to be some supplementary feeding of protein required, but it'll be for a shorter time because lambs will be staying on track with their growth rates, achieving their sale weights faster off the property and relieving stocking rate over those dry summer months when you need to preserve ground cover. Also, I see the advantage of grazing standing crop to finish lamb is that it's low risk and proven practice. You don't need to learn any new skills. You're already growing crops and have adapted varieties that perform well in your environment. You're just using the crop for a different and potentially more profitable purpose in the end. Thanks for your time today, Bailey. We really appreciate you sharing your valuable insights into how you've incorporated a standing crop pasture system into your farm business and the benefits it's brought to your livestock production and managing soils. Today's podcast, a project collaboration between Birchip Cropping Group and McKillop Farm Management Group, has been supported by the Australian Government's National Landcare Smart Farms Small Grants Program. For more information about managing the grazing of standing crops, search the Birchip Cropping Group and McKillop Farm Management Group websites.